think of the complex steps that would be involved in developing something like a bee if you were to make like a little drone, a miniature drone or something. All the hundreds of thousands of lines of software programming that would be necessary to get that man-made object to do what these insects do instinctively or through design. Well, good morning, everybody. It's my privilege to be able to speak at this conference again. I was here in 2022 and shared a little bit more about my experience at Ball State University and some general sort of cosmological arguments for intelligent design. And so they invited me back today, and this topic of honeybees, it's way off topic from any of my professional research, but I'm delighted to be able to share with you about some of what I feel are God's most amazingly designed creatures. And I hope that you'll come to agree with me as we go through this presentation. And I think everything that I've learned about honeybees, and by the way, I'll get to a story a little bit later of how I ended up being interested in this and why there's a physicist talking to you about honeybees. But everything about honeybees is amazing in its design. I think that really the amazing thing is, how could anyone look in depth at honeybees and not be impressed with the design factor in their lives, their behaviors, their particular body plans, and all that they do, everything about them. And the Bible does encourage us, as this verse here on this slide suggests, that we should ask the beasts, and they will teach you, the birds of the heavens, and they will tell you. God didn't just make things for no purpose. Part of the purpose is to teach us, to instruct us in His ability as Creator, to instruct us with some of His wisdom, to even comfort us. We'll get back to that later. So one of the things about bees is that they're not solitary creatures. If you look up about them, you'll find that they are classified as social insects, social bees. Well, they form a very complex cooperative community. They don't just each live independently. They together have roles within their bee community that allow the entire colony to survive and to thrive. And how do they do this? Well, scientists will say that it's genetically programmed, like software, into their own DNA. But think of the complex steps that would be involved in developing something like a bee if you were to make like a little drone, a miniature drone or something. All the, I would say, hundreds of thousands of lines of software programming that would be necessary to get that man-made object to do what these insects do instinctively or through design. One of the things that we'll look at here first is well known about bees. Their honeycomb, the structure, it turns out, is optimized. And one of the things that you can see in the upper left of this slide is that the shape, being hexagonal, is actually the most efficient way to pack together a volume that's going to enclose, in this case, the developing bee or the honey, with the minimal amount of material. Now, the wax that the honeycomb is made of is kind of an expensive commodity for the bees to produce. And so they don't want to waste space. And for example, a cylinder, you might think, well, that's easier. Let's just stack up little tubes. The bees could put their honey in the tubes. The bees could have their developing larvae in the tubes. But it turns out that there's wasted space if you try to stack cylinders, but no wasted space if you stack up hexagons. And the hexagonal shape also has remarkable strength as well. And even engineers have copied this for aircraft, aerospace applications. So how do they make this? Well, to make it, they need wax. It just so happens that bees will be able to produce wax. Now, how did that come about? Think if we had a need for something. Suppose we needed wax. How many generations of humans would have to live before we started exuding wax, such as is coming out of the abdomen of this bee? And then what would we know to do with it to be able to make these perfect structures? Again, thinking of a bee, their brains, I read one place, about the size of a sesame seed or less, just the tiniest little thing, and yet they're able to do all of this. Honeycomb construction is optimized for multiple purposes. I've already mentioned, for storing honey, for being a developmental incubator for bees throughout their life cycle. But it's also optimized to provide the most sort of bang for the buck, so that the bees don't waste this precious commodity of wax. And, responsible engineering firms today pay people to try to do the same thing. Now, the honeybee life cycle is amazing from beginning to end. It begins with the queen bee, one queen bee for each colony of bees that might have tens of thousands of individual members. Just one queen, mind you. Lays an egg, tiny little thing, and it will then develop over a period of days. First the larval stage, about a week, then the pupal stage for another week, finally hatching out at about the third week. Believe it or not, the queen bee, which you might think would be more complicated, has the shortest sort of incubation period. But the remarkable thing is that this queen can lay more than her body weight in eggs, not every month or every year, but every day. Each egg, so we're talking about 1,000 to 1,500 eggs, 2,000 eggs laid per day by the queen, each one then developing either into a worker bee, which are all females, or a drone, the males, which don't do a lot. What is God trying to teach us? I'm not sure here. Maybe it's just a comment on the way things are. Thank you, yeah. Or the queen can even lay an egg that, through the assistance of the worker bees, the female nurse bees, can be developed into another queen bee. So this is a self-replicating machine, if you will, if you want to use the machine analogy. Scientists don't know how to make a self-replicating, functional, complex machine. And yet the bee does it just fine at a remarkable rate. About 3 weeks, what makes a bee turn into either a worker bee, a drone, a male, or another queen bee? Well, the queen, as she lays the egg, can decide to fertilize it. If she does, it becomes a female worker bee. If she doesn't, it becomes a drone bee. Well, what about, how do you get the queen? Obviously a female. That happens after the egg is laid. All bees, as they're first laid as an egg, are fed by the nurse bees a mixture called royal jelly for a period of about 3 days. It's very nutrient rich. But after about 3 days, most of the bees, the larvae, are switched to just kind of a brood jelly, it's called. It's not quite as concentrated or packed with particular proteins, and they will develop into worker bees, they're females. But the ones that they want to make into another queen, they just keep feeding it this royal jelly, and it then causes this larva to develop rather quickly into a queen bee, fully functioning, another replicator that can reproduce the thousands of eggs per day. I'd say that in some way there's something to see here. There's a colony of bees, tens of thousands of bees, but a division of labor, maybe wise resource management, one replicator per colony. I don't know if that's the best way to do it that you could possibly design, but it's the way that works for the bee colony. This royal jelly that I mentioned it's not just honey. It starts with the honey, but then through special glands in the bee's forehead, essentially, it is converted into this particular substance that is fed to the bees that, if they keep feeding it, will develop a new queen bee. Royal jelly has all these functional activities: antioxidant, antimicrobial, anti-cancer, anti-aging, anti-allergic. It's like, wouldn't you like to have some of that just to be able to glean the positive effects of it? I read one article that pointed out that detailed studies of this substance that's produced by the bees shows at least 9 major so-called royal jelly proteins, each one made up of between 400 to 578 amino acids selected in a particular sequence to create a particular protein. 9 different proteins, each of that roughly 500 amino acid length as they're being selected and put together. That is, by the way, according to computational biology, far beyond the limits that natural chance could ever produce. And so we see here an example of something within a living system that exceeds what are known, according like Steve Meyer, Bill Dembski, the probabilistic resources of this entire universe, designed to feed and nourish the bees. Another remarkable feature about the bees is that they don't just kind of live in a neighborhood or in a city all doing their own thing. They essentially make almost like a multi-celled organism, with each bee representing a single cell. Researchers will say that the colony of bees is greater than the sum of its individual members. How does this colony of bees accomplish all that it needs to do in order to survive? Again, this represents higher level functionality. This only arises when there's careful planning, where the individual components of a complex system work together to accomplish needed goals. I mean, perhaps humans could do that with correct, intelligent leadership. Bees do it with the sesame seed-sized brain. So, does a bee have a mind? I believe it does. But there's also something researchers will refer to as a hive mind, kind of the group think, if you will, of a bee colony. And it is remarkable. It's not like there's just one general in charge of the entire army of bees. The queen, for example, doesn't control everything in the hive. You might think, well, the queen should be in charge, but it's not really the case. The worker bees, they can decide, for example, that it's maybe time to make a new queen. And on their own, they can feed more royal jelly to one or more of the eggs, the larvae, as they're developing, and create a new queen. There's other aspects of the bee colony's behavior that I'll get to later that also indicate this group think, this hive mind. Now, there's a lot of research, a lot of focus these days on trying to understand the mind, just of, say, a single entity, human or otherwise, just a single mind. But what about a mind that's distributed in thousands of different members? How can that just come about? I think it is particularly difficult when you see that it's not orchestrating chaos, but a common purpose for the good of the survival of the hive. So these coordinated activities include these items listed here. They all exhibit a sense of purpose. We could talk about how the bees in the hive, there's a certain subset of them that tend the queen. This is extremely important because if you're laying a couple thousand eggs a day, you don't have time for much else. And so they are fed. The queens are fed, they are groomed, they're clean, their waste is disposed of. Everything about the queen is tended to by a group of you almost think of as royal courtiers. Once the eggs are developing, the nurse bees, by the way, are the younger ones. This is one of the first jobs that a bee will be assigned or will develop into as it is first born. It becomes a nurse bee to take care of other ones that are developing. The harvesting or foraging, this is what we often think of with bees, flying out from the hive, looking for flowers and nectar and pollen and bringing it back. This activity is assigned to some of the later stages of life of the bees. The ones that leave the hive are the most mature. Guarding the hive, you have to protect it. It's almost like an immune system from attack. In fact, these coordinated activities could be likened to the activities within a single organism. You've got kind of a mind, you've got an immune system, you've got homeostasis, you need to regulate things like your body temperature. Well, the hive has to be regulated, amazingly, to within just a very narrow temperature range, ideally around 93 degrees Fahrenheit. It sounds like summer in Dallas, I think. It would be ideal, but if it gets just a couple degrees colder, well, the bees have to stock up on honey, and they begin to do isometric exercises with their thorax muscles, and then they fan the hive to distribute the air, the even temperature distribution. If it gets too hot, well, then they have to set up a circulatory system. Some bees position themselves to draw air into the hive with their fanning wings. Other ones are positioned in a different place and in different orientation to fan the air out of the hive. So it goes in and it circulates around and it comes out. They can even go off and collect water, bring it back to the hive, cause it to evaporate. It's evaporative cooling, just to maintain the proper temperature, especially while the brood is developing within very narrow ranges. And then this colony also has to reproduce as a time. And we're talking about a reproduction at a particular time that's not just the queen laying more eggs. The superorganism of the bee colony eventually reproduces itself as well. So you've got individuals reproducing with the queen laying eggs, and then you've got the whole multi-celled organism reproducing itself later in what's known as the swarm activity. So with pollination, this is one of the key activities that the bees undergo as they visit the flowers, and this serves double purposes. It benefits humans, for example. A large percentage of the fruits and vegetables and seed crops that we enjoy need bees for pollination purposes. Adds a lot of revenue to agriculture. Nectar collectors, so there's pollen, that's sort of a protein source for the bees. Then there's nectar, and that's more like a sweet source. And that's what is made into the honey. I saw some close-up photographs of the bee mouth parts that allow them to extract the nectar. It's like some nightmare show out of a late-night movie, but particularly adapted, you would say, or designed to extract the nectar and then to be able to carry it back to the hive. So turning it into honey, this is another, it's not just nectar. It comes back as nectar, which has a higher water content. The sugars, sucrose, need to be broken down into simpler sugars by the addition of enzymes in the bee's honey stomach, and then it's passed around from one bee to the next, and they finally put it in a hexagonal cell for storage, and then it's fanned with the wings of the bees to reduce the moisture content, and then they add other enzymes to create even hydrogen peroxide, believe it or not, antimicrobial properties. And honey then becomes one of the substances that is a food source that will never spoil. Quite remarkable that honey has been found that's over 2,000 years old and it's still edible. So flowers and bees have a symbiotic relationship. The origin of flowers, the angiosperms, is a rather abrupt appearance in the fossil record, roughly 130 million years ago, according to scientists. And, well, it turns out bees, pollinators that assist the flowers and the flowering plants also showed up roughly at the same time. Again, I would say that that shows design. This honey, millions of pounds of honey are consumed every year by people. And the remarkable thing is bees make more honey than they need. And that allows us to harvest the excess for our own benefit. I think that bees serve a purpose. They're extremely important in this ecosystem of flowering plants and pollination and the reproduction of plants. But I think that God designed the bees with a rigidly orchestrated lifestyle because it was so important. It couldn't be left to decisions or chances. Everything was built into their sort of DNA, their genetic programming, so that it wouldn't fail. And again, bees do serve others. They don't just exist for themselves. And that again speaks of design. It's not survival of the fittest with everybody else. Who cares about them? It's only me that's surviving. Bees serve many other species through their life cycles. We don't have a lot of time to go into this, but this is one of the more fascinating aspects of behavior that you can find. Is their ability to communicate where they have found a good source of nectar. And they will range from the hive up to 2 to 3 miles away in any direction. So if they find some rich source of flowers that has good nectar and they bring some back, they can pass it around. But how do they communicate to the other bees where to go to find this? I mean, just think if you are in a wooded area, a field area, and how long would it take you to walk 2-3 miles? Up to an hour. And how could you tell someone to go there, how far to go, in what direction? The bees have it all worked out, and they can communicate it through what's known as the Waggle dance, and actually a researcher earned their Nobel Prize for deciphering this communication method that the bees have. Again, they don't figure this out. It's pre-programmed into them. And without this, the bee colony would suffer. So I won't go through all the details of it, but again, just try to imagine how difficult it would be to design a little drone to replicate what the bees can do. And I've been told that they even, when they are leaving the hive, they kind of circle around, and in that little sesame seed-sized brain, this is like a tongue twister, I've got a sesame seed-sized brain, they memorize the landscape around the hive. Because guess what? They not only have to be able to tell the other bees where to go to find the honey, but when they're 2-3 miles away, they've got to get back to the hive. A bee cannot survive on its own. It will die quickly if it's separated from the hive. So within the hive, things have to be communicated and orchestrated. Communication among living systems is a remarkable topic of study because we communicate, intelligence communicates. And here you've got these creatures that are insects, and they're communicating in a very complex way, not only through this dance, but through pheromones, which are released that they can sense, and it communicates broadly, but through touch, they pass nectar, for example, from one bee to the other, all of this within a hive. And guess what? It's dark in there. Maybe hadn't never been inside a beehive, but it's dark, and so it can't rely on sight. The communication within the hive is through other means. They even have sounds that they produce. Well, here's the last part of this, and this is how I got into studying about bees. One day, my wife comes into the house and says, "There's a scary-looking swarm of bees outside in the lilac bush." And I immediately got a little anxious about that because earlier I had been mowing the lawn outside, not that day, but earlier in the season, and had mown over a yellow jacket nest. Not a good idea, it was in the ground, and I got stung, and it was not fun. So I was a little tense about hearing this report of a scary-looking swarm of bees, and I wasn't sure if yellow jackets or what, and I came outside, and this photograph here is from our lilac bush. It was this basketball-sized swarm of bees, and I could see they were honeybees. So we called friends who were beekeepers. They were excited for a swarm of bees. They come over with their pickup truck, get this empty portable hive, put it underneath this swarm, and the guy with just a little bit of beekeeping gear on goes up and shakes the branch. It's like, oh yeah, that's a good thing to do when you got. But the whole thing just plunks down into this box, except for several hundred of them, which sort of festooned over the edges of the box, and he's like scraping them up in big clusters and dumping them in there, shaking off the bees into the box. This is like a new world for me. I didn't quite know this is what you had to do, but anyway, they brought it back home, and it became a viable hive that they could add to their other hives. It was amazing. So this is how the whole colony reproduces. Once in a while, if it gets crowded in the hive, if there's too many, if there's no more room, the queen will decide to leave with about half of the members, and they go out and they scout for a new home. Well, what about the half of the bees that are left behind without a queen? Do they just die? No, they have at the same time begun to prepare for the birth of a new queen by feeding it that royal beef, the royal jelly being fed to some of the other larvae. So this swarm is bees looking for a new home. And, if you read about this, you read words like, these are other researchers saying remarkable reliability, ingenuity, a decision-making process. It sounds like they're describing, elite intellectuals in some organization. But again, these are insects. And I made this quote or statement at the bottom. If nature was a god, it would be manifesting intelligent design in the life of bees. And it's easy to just say, well, look what nature did. Look what nature produced. But as a physicist, what I do for my career in physics is study nature. And nature is composed of particles and particle interactions. And there's really only a few forces, and they all just push or pull, like gravity pulls stuff together. The electric force pushes or pulls. That's it. There's no intelligence in the forces of nature to collect atoms together to make complex molecules, to make bees, to make a hive mind, to serve a purpose. So to say nature did it is an unscientific statement. It reflects in this evolutionary mindset what I would call a cultural mythology, a willingness to almost deify nature, to endow it with a sort of a life force that supposedly accomplishes what really should be only a creator's portfolio of ingenuity. So just summarizing here, all of these complex features of the honeybee colony, I think each one gives glory to the creator. Now, I wouldn't say that honeybees are something that we should try to emulate. We don't want the structure of a honeybee society to be imposed upon us. They are all operating under biochemical directives. They're not free. To impose that upon us would do violence to what makes us human, having free wills. And God has given us a way to cooperate that extends beyond a forced biochemical directive. And I believe that the best motivation for our behavior towards one another that serves the common good is love. And So I'm pretty much going to stop there, and just this slide, the verse at the top, it's the words of Jesus. Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. And I happened to catch this photograph, and when I looked at it, it's like there's a bee there. And anyway, so the lilies of the field, they grow, but they need the help of the bees for the next generation through pollination. So anyway, thank you for your attention, and appreciate it.